She came home from dropping her children at school the way any parent does on autopilot, thinking about lunches, carpools, the little rituals that make a family move. It should have been ordinary. Instead, the morning would become a turning point none of them could ever come back from. When first responders found her in the garage, something about the scene didn't feel like the random act of a stranger. Please help this channel grow. Like the video, try the new hype feature, leave a comment, and subscribe for more stories. This helps us a lot. Thank you. The terror that had been stalking her life, anonymous messages, frightening photographs, had a shape now. It had a name. The person who had promised to protect her had been the one who plotted to terrify her. In a case that would play out like a slow-burning, digital-age thriller, investigators say the stalker wasn't at the periphery at all. He was sitting at the kitchen table. This is the story of Kristil, a mother, an engineer, a dancer whose warnings were written down in a notebook and in her heart, and the unbelievable conclusion those warnings would reach. This is the threat from inside. Kristil Krug lived the sort of life that reads simple on paper, but felt full in the small moments. Mornings with 3 children, a career in science, weekend dance classes, and quiet evenings that held ordinary comforts. To friends and family, she was steady, bright, and deeply invested in her children's lives. To investigators, she would become more than a victim. She would be the careful chronicler of the threat that followed her. Sometime in the autumn of 2023, things started to shift. Kristil began receiving messages, emails, and texts that were vulgar, menacing, and unnervingly specific. The messages referenced places she had been, times she had left, details that made her feel watched. She started keeping a log, dates, times, the exact words. She saved screenshots, printed emails, and told trusted friends that she felt unsafe. She told police she believed her family was being stalked. Those warnings, the logs, the phone calls, the nights spent double-checking locks would later form the backbone of an investigation that was as much about zeros and ones as it was about trust and betrayal. Because the messages were not the work of a random stranger. According to prosecutors, they were manufactured by somebody very close. To understand how the threat took shape, we have to look at the friction in the marriage. Sources close to the case described a relationship that had become strained, arguments, distance, and a couple growing apart. Prosecutors later said the husband, faced with a marriage he couldn't control, began to create a crisis he hoped would bring them closer. In the months before the fatal morning, Kristil did what many people do when they feel threatened. She documented. She installed cameras on the property. She told police about the threatening messages. She confided in family members. And as those close to her watched, the abuse did not stop, it escalated, with messages that were increasingly personalized and aggressive. December 14, 2023, began like many mornings, school runs, commute plans, a routine. Kristil left the house to drop off her children and returned to the family garage shortly before 8 a.m. What happened in the space between the driveway and the garage would change everything. Investigators later described an ambush. Kristil was assaulted in the garage as she returned. The attack was sudden and brutal enough to render her unconscious. When officers arrived after a welfare check, they found her severely injured, life-threatening wounds inflicted in the place she should have been safeguarded. She was a mother of 3. Her children had been dropped at school that morning and would return to a home now marked by silence. The neighborhood would later learn that the horror had not come from some faceless stranger. It had, prosecutors said, been orchestrated from within the family's own orbit. Paramedics tried to save her, but the injuries were fatal. The life Kristil had built, the small rituals, the laughter, the bedtime stories ended abruptly on that garage floor. What remained were the messages she had saved and the concentrated, meticulous work of detectives trying to find who had turned her life into a campaign of fear. When investigators first approached the case, it had the elements of a modern mystery: anonymous messages, digital breadcrumbs, and a grieving family. The challenge was to turn scattered threads into a coherent timeline, to follow the code and metadata that, quietly and impartially, record human actions. Police reviewed Kristil's reporting and the physical evidence at the scene. They cataloged messages in her phone and email inbox. They analyzed surveillance footage and checked analytics from the security cameras she had installed. Early on, something stood out. Certain messages were tied not to a distant number, but to devices and accounts that had connections to the family. As digital forensics experts would later explain in court, some of the threatening emails and texts could be associated with IP addresses and devices that traced back to the husband's workplace and private devices. Prosecutors say the harassment campaign was elaborate. It included previously unknown email accounts, burner phones purchased with untraceable methods, and messages that arrived at precisely orchestrated moments. A key piece of evidence was a photograph, a seemingly ordinary image of the husband arriving at work that was attached to one of the threatening emails sent to Kristil. Forensic analysis revealed something odd. The photograph had been taken in selfie mode on a timer, which raised the question, who was really behind the lens? Detectives dug deeper into purchase records. They learned that burner phones had been bought with gift cards and that those phones had been used to send harassing texts. They cross-checked the timing of the messages with security footage and the family's own schedules. Where a stalker's trail was initially anonymous, it developed a pattern that increasingly pointed inward. There were complications. At times, surveillance had gaps. Cameras were disabled during critical windows, creating shadowed periods in the timeline. There were also biological traces, DNA evidence that included profiles not immediately attributable to a known person. Defense attorneys would later highlight those ambiguities. Investigators and prosecutors had to build a case that relied as much on the architecture of deception as on a single smoking gun. Digital evidence became the spine of the prosecution's narrative. Analysts traced email headers, determined routing paths, examined device identifiers, and showed step by step that some of the threatening communications had been sent using systems or devices tied to the husband. They reconstructed how burner phones might have been purchased and activated, and how messages could be sent to appear to come from another man. Investigators also interviewed friends, family members, co-workers, and neighbors. People described the marriage as strained. Some testified that Kristil had expressed concern that the stalker might be someone close, even telling her husband that she couldn't rule him out as a suspect. That admission would later become an important thread in the legal narrative, a person who sensed danger within the walls of home. As the digital and testimonial threads were woven together, prosecutors assembled a theory that the husband had manufactured the threat to control his wife, to frighten her, and then position himself as protector. When the plan failed or threatened discovery, they say, he escalated to murder to silence the truth. Multiple communications sent to Kristil that contained personal details and threatening language. Some messages were traced to devices and accounts linked to the husband's digital footprint. Phones used to send texts were purchased in ways meant to hide the buyer. Investigators linked those purchases back through transaction patterns and gift card uses. A photograph attached to a threatening email, ostensibly proving the stalker was nearby, contained digital clues consistent with being taken by the husband's phone in selfie mode. Security cameras showed windows of disabled footage that corresponded to crucial moments in the timeline. Friends and family described a deteriorating marriage, and Kristil's expressed fear about someone close to her, including the unsettling possibility that she could not rule her husband out as the source of the threats. Taken together, these items conveyed to jurors a portrait of contrivance rather than coincidence. When the case went to trial, the courtroom became a theater where the prosecution's digital tapestry met the defense's insistence on doubt. Prosecutors called forensic analysts who explained the technical evidence in plain terms. How IP addresses work, what email headers reveal, and why metadata can betray an attempted deception. They walked jurors through minutes and timestamps, showing how messages arrived and how devices connected. The defense pushed back. They argued that there was no direct physical evidence, no definitive DNA placing the husband at the moment of the assault, and they questioned the handling of some evidence, and the interpretive leaps the prosecution asked jurors to accept. Unidentified DNA and surveillance gaps were emphasized as troubling uncertainties. But jurors were shown more than a single piece of evidence. They were shown a pattern, purchases, and messages that could be explained only by someone with knowledge, access, and motive. The prosecution argued motive was simple. With the marriage eroding, the husband allegedly manufactured a threat so he could be the protector and draw his wife back into the marriage, and when the plan threatened exposure, he turned lethal to keep the secret. Testimony about the husband's conduct and the digital forensics wove together into a narrative jurors found persuasive. In April 2025, the jury delivered its decision. They found the husband guilty on counts of first-degree murder, multiple counts of stalking, and criminal impersonation. The verdict reflected the jury's view that the harassment campaign and the killing were not disconnected acts, but part of a single, calculated scheme. On sentencing day, the legal outcome was clear. The husband received life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge imposed the mandatory sentence called for by the conviction, a final, irreversible legal conclusion to a case that began with anonymous threats and ended with loss. For Kristil's family, the sentence was a mixture of relief and continuing sorrow. In public statements, relatives called the act selfish and monstrous, and spoke of the void left in 3 children's lives. The prosecutor's office framed the conviction as the result of painstaking investigative work that followed the digital trail to reveal a human betrayal. The children, young, bewildered, and grieving, would now be raised by relatives. The community grappled with how a family could hide such danger behind closed doors. And for advocates and professionals focused on stalking and domestic violence, the case became a study in how technology can be weaponized inside a home. Beyond the sentencing, questions persisted. Some evidence anomalies remained discussed in reporting, such as unidentified DNA profiles and gaps in surveillance, which the defense highlighted. But for the legal system and Kristil's family, the central question of who orchestrated the harassment and who killed Kristil had been answered in court. Talk to those who knew Kristil, and you won't hear only the facts of the case. You'll hear about a woman who danced, who worked in scientific labs, who loved her children fiercely. Her life was one of ordinary joys, baking with her kids, attending recitals, the kind of small, everyday things that become sharp and luminous in the wake of loss. The family left behind parents, siblings. Children carry a grief that is complicated by the knowledge that the danger came from inside. There is anger, a desire for accountability, and the slow, private work of rebuilding a life that no longer holds the person who once gave it shape. For the children, the loss is not simply the absence of a parent, but the removal of the woman who organized mornings, dried tears, and read bedtime stories. The sentence cannot restore those moments, but the conviction did provide a legal recognition of the harm and a formal acknowledgement of responsibility. This case holds several lessons that resonate beyond the headlines. Stalking often begins with small acts of intrusion that escalate. The warning signs, repeated messages, personalized threats, photos that imply someone is watching should be taken seriously. Kristil kept a log. She reported what happened. That documentation became crucial. Technology can hide and reveal. The same digital devices that can be misused to terrorize can also leave the fingerprints that investigators use to uncover deception. Metadata, purchase histories, and IP logs are messy and technical, but in capable hands they can reveal patterns that point investigators where they need to go. Systems can fail, and vigilance matters. Cameras can be disabled, surveillance can have gaps. That is why corroborating evidence, testimony, receipts, multiple data points matters so much in building a full picture. Finally, when someone you trust is behaving in ways that frighten you, it is okay to speak up, to document, and to seek protection. It is better to be wrong and safe than right and unprotected. The most unsettling thing about this story isn't merely that a crime was committed. It's that someone wore the face of safety while weaving a campaign of fear. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about how well we know the people closest to us, and about how intimate betrayal can be camouflaged by routine. Kristil's life was made of ordinary, loving details. Those details are what were stolen, and those details are what remain in memory. In a world where messages can be scheduled, phones can be burned, and photos can be staged, Truth often hides in the quiet metadata of everyday life in the logs we keep and the small acts of care we offer one another. Remember her as more than a headline. Remember Kris, a mother, a friend, a scientist, a dancer. And remember to listen when a voice says, "I feel watched." Because sometimes the threat is not outside the house. Sometimes it is sitting at the kitchen table. If you found this deep dive meaningful, subscribe for more carefully researched chapters of Chronicles of Crime. If you or someone you know is experiencing stalking or abuse, please seek help. Share your thoughts below, respectfully. Which part of this case moved you or changed how you think about online evidence and domestic safety?